Good morning. Welcome to Creek Sin today. It's a busy day today. First Sunday of the month. Next week we all lose, right? We lose an hour of sleep. So get ready for that. But a lot of things going on today. Baptism going on. That's my favorite thing. We baptized a husband and wife last service. Going to baptize some more today. And ministry connection going on outside. You might have seen it when you came in. Hope you'll stop by there if you haven't already. Find out where you can be involved in our church and in our community. And we're starting a brand new series today called Gearing Down. And how about this stage? Doesn't this just look wonderful up here? This is just great, isn't it? Wow. Great way to start out. And he wouldn't want me to say anything, but I got to thank Scott Kennedy over here for all the hard work that he did in putting all this together, and the little bit that Bobby Leonard did. And just kidding, Bobby. Just kidding, Bobby. Just kidding. And so, we're still, when you unplug something and plug it back in, we're still working the bugs out with all the sound and stuff. And we had some problems last service, but I think we've pretty much fixed them all. And as soon as I say that, something's going to happen. But just bear with us. We'll get through it. This series called Gearing Down. I think it's time for us to do exactly what that song says. Just breathe. Just breathe. When's the last time you just really took a deep, deep breath, let it out, and just paused? We're going to be talking about this the next 3 Sundays, this concept of Sabbath rest. And today I'm going to kind of introduce the concept to you and talk about how God made it to be. And then the next couple of weeks we're going to talk about, next week we'll talk about stress and how that robs us of the rest that we need. And then the very next week, we're going to talk about overload and how we get so burdened and busy with things that it robs us of our rest. And on that particular Sunday, which is the last one, and I know that's kind of the end of spring break, but I have a very important announcement that I need to share with you that involves everyone. So I hope you'll be here for that. But I hope you'll be here for all of it. And if you have to miss on spring break or something, catch it online. I want to show you something. You guys are probably going to salivate when I show you this picture, but go ahead and put it up, Jason. Let's just put the knife in right now, right? This is a 1956 F-100. It's an exact replica of the truck that my dad had, and I learned to drive in that truck. Now, this was, I was probably, you're going to kind of not believe this, but I was probably about 9 years old when I learned to drive. I actually, on my grandfather's farm, I drove tractors all over the place, right, Robert? So we learned to drive when we were kids. But my dad taught me how to drive in this particular truck, and we lived in a very small town, population 170. I still remember that sign. And dirt roads. So we'd get on this dirt road, and there wasn't anybody on it, and Dad would let me drive in this truck. And the way I learned how to do it well was we would drive for a little while, and he'd say, "How do you think you did?" And I said, "Well, I think I did great." And he said, "Well, look behind you." And in the gravel dirt roads, it was like this. And I learned how to make that straight. That's how I learned to drive straight, was looking back and seeing how I did. But I started out real slow because this particular truck had not what we call 3 on a tree, and I know what you younger ones don't even know what a shift is, and a clutch, but we had 4 on the floor, and this particular truck had 5 on the floor because it had an extra gear, and that gear, guess what, was called granny gear. How many of you remember that? Yeah, you old, just like me. Granny gear. I got a picture of it here. That's what it looked like, big old thing sticking up. And first gear on this particular one was actually granny gear, and it's kind of separate from others. You put that sucker in granny gear, and it would just crawl. And that's how I learned to drive. It would just be a crawl. You can YouTube it, Google it on YouTube, and you can find some videos of somebody with a truck in granny gear, and you'll look in the window, and it's a 3-year-old driving it. It's just, that's how slow it is. That's how I learned to drive. But I also used that truck as I got older. In the summers, I would haul hay for extra money, me and a couple of buddies of mine. And we would use my dad's truck. And what was great about my dad's truck was In a hayfield, you put that thing in granny gear, and you don't even have to drive it. It just crawls along, and you can just put the bales of hay on. You don't have to work near as hard at getting in and out of the truck, guiding it to where you go. The only time you got in there was to turn around and come back the other way. It was great. Granny gear is great. Granny gear is slow. And sometimes we need to put our lives into granny gear. We really do. Because you and I know this. We're in a society now that works more and rests less. We're in a basically 24/7 culture, aren't we? I mean, it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's the kind of culture that we live in. And let me just kind of give you some statistics and throw some things at you, make you think about something as we get into this message today about what this has done to our country. We've become the world leader basically in a lot of things, but we're also the world leader in nonstop work. And here's what an article I read said, that we work an average of 50 weeks a year. Okay, well, you think, I take my 2 weeks vacation. But here's what you don't realize. A few years ago, I was on a weekend vacation and ran into this couple from Australia who was on holiday. That's their vacation, right? Holiday. And I said, well, hey, how much vacation do you have? And they said, 3 months. They have to take 3 months in Australia off. You believe that? So they work 40 weeks a year compared to our 50. It's totally different here in America. 40% of Americans put in a 50-hour work week. An estimated 60% of absences from work are from psychological problems due to stress and job burnout, and it's costing us over $57 billion a year. Crazy. In Japan, it's known as karoshi, or death from overwork. In the Japanese government, they've reported 10,000 cases a year. 10,000 cases a year of managers, executives, and engineers who have died from overwork. It's incredible. 45% of workers in America report high job stress, and 25% call their jobs the number one stress factor in their lives. Here in America, life just comes at us at warp speed, and it's 24/7, 24/7. We just don't stop. And, I haven't told you anything that you don't already know. And I haven't even added, I only talked about work. I haven't even added the stress the kids bring along, right? And all the activities that we have to get them to and be involved in. Here's what we got to understand. From the very beginning of time, at the very beginning of the Bible, God created a principle that we have to learn about gearing down and resting. And here's what we're going to talk about today and really every week. Rest, ironically, is an activity, but it's an activity that must be planned for and then pursued. We first of all have to understand that it's a concept, and we're going to talk about that today, that it's a very important concept. And then we have to plan for it, but not just plan for it, because how many times have you planned to take time off, but you didn't pursue it? We have to also follow up. We have to pursue it. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 2, because that's where God first initiated this principle of rest, of Sabbath rest. And the Sabbath, the purpose of the Sabbath is not simply just to rejuvenate yourself so you can do more work. I mean, that's part of it. But it's also not just for you to just sleep and have pleasure. That's part of it. But there's this very important Sabbath part of it that we need to understand, not only as Americans, but especially as Christians. Genesis chapter 2, we're going to begin reading in verse 1. Just 3 verses this morning. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Snuggled here in the middle of gardens and snakes and floods, God's little secret on gearing down can make sure that you're balanced in work and rest are there. Your life has to be balanced. Now, in these 3 verses, God introduces 2 principles, the principle of work and the principle of rest. We begin by seeing that God finished his work on creation, then he rested. But he didn't rest until his work was done. Look at verse 1 again. It says, thus the heaven and earth were completed in all their vast array. The work was done. God worked for 6 days, rested on the 7th day. And from the very beginning of human existence, God built these 2 principles, work and rest, into everyday life. God makes it plain that we are to work. He set the example of work. So don't misunderstand this series or this message today to think anything about there's something wrong with work or a good work ethic. That's not it at all. God had a job to do when he created this world, and he stayed at it till he finished, and he did it right. But Adam had barely been created and was still a newlywed when God put him to work. He gave him a garden to live in, but his job was to tend that garden, weed it, make sure that it grew what it was supposed to grow. And incidentally, nowhere in the Bible, and I've read it many, many times, I do not find the concept of retirement anywhere. It's not there. You can look yourself. It's not there. Now, there's nothing wrong with retiring from a good-paying job. Nothing wrong at all. But what I believe is that when we do get to retire, that then we get to work for God for free. Because there's always a job that God has for us to do. Always. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there for you who look forward to retirement. At the same time that God showed us how to work, he showed us how to rest. Look at verse 2. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. And the first time anyone in history ever rested was God. And he rested on the 7th day. He had finished his work, was satisfied with what he had done, and he evidently thought that it was important to take a break and set aside a day just to rest from his work. The last part of that verse says he rested from all his work. Write this down. Gearing down gives us rest from our work. Now, why did God rest? I mean, let me assure you, it wasn't because he was tired. Psalm 21 tells us that God never sleeps, nor does he slumber. He does not get tired. Why did he rest? I believe the answer is in the last verse of the previous chapter, verse 31. Let me put it up there. It says this: God saw that all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and morning the 6th day. After creating the world, God looked around and saw that it was very good. God didn't just cease from his labor. He stopped and enjoyed what he had made. Now, what does that mean for us? That we need to stop and enjoy God, enjoy his creation, and enjoy the results of our work. That's what God did. That's what we should do. The whole point of the Sabbath rest is joy in what God has done. Now, we know a lot about this concept of rest from the very Hebrew word. It's the word Sabbath. Sabbath. And in Hebrew, it's both a noun and it's also a verb. As a verb, the word Sabbath, from which we get the word Sabbath, means to cease or to quit working. So when you hear that word as a verb, Sabbath, stop working, cease working. That's what it means. As a noun, the word denoted the 7th day of the week, or the Sabbath day. It was a day of rest, a day to stop or cease working. And we're going to talk more about this concept of the Sabbath in just a moment, but keep this in mind. Whatever else the Sabbath was meant to be, it was meant to be a day of rest. When I was a young boy, my parents made me take piano lessons. Now, you know, as I'm a musician now, you think, well, why would you say that? Because I love to play the piano by ear. I did not want to read music. And I struggled with that when I was young because I could hear a song and pretty much play it. My teacher, however, as patient and as loving as she was, she wanted me to learn to read music. And so I remember this one particular lesson. I was trying to read music, and then I got to these things in the music. One was a little squiggly thing, and the other thing looked like a hat. And I just plowed through it. And she stopped. She said, "Bobby, stop." I said, "What's wrong?" That is a rest. A rest. And I had a very tough time understanding the concept. Why should I rest? I'm going good here. Why should I stop? Because that rest is as important as the notes in the music. It's there for a reason. It is there telling that instrumentalist or vocalist, whatever it be, that you need to stop and rest here. You may come in a little later on. You may not come in again at all, but it is there for a reason. And in the music of life, God has given us this principle of rest. It's there for a reason. And he's even made our bodies, because every 6 measures we call days, we're supposed to take a rest. 24/7 is not in God's vocabulary. It's just not. All work and no play. You've heard this. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Well, all work and no play makes Jack a bad boy because he's breaking one of God's sacred commandments, to rest. Look again at what God does for this day. Verse 3. It says, "Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." God had finished his work, was satisfied with what he'd done, and he set aside a day just to rest. And then we're told he blessed the 7th day. Now, we're not told that he blessed the other 6 days, but he marked off this day of rest as extremely special because later on, he's going to move from blessing the 7th day to making it a commandment to observe. Over the next book of the Bible in Exodus, God moves from just blessing it to commanding it. Look at what it says in Exodus 20, verse 9. God says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy." And he's laying out to Moses and his people the commandments. And this is one of them. "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to rest, the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." And again, we see how God blessed the Sabbath day, not the other days. And then over just a few chapters in Exodus 23:12, God shows us why it's important to do this. He says, 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. And I want you to circle that word refreshed, because in the Hebrew, that is the word that means to breathe. To breathe. Just breathe. When you've run to the point of exhaustion, the way you refresh yourself is to stop and get your breath. God has made us so that we need 1 day a week just to catch our breath. So gearing down not only gives us rest from our work, gearing down also gives us refreshment. It refreshes our walk. Over the years, Coca-Cola has had some great advertising campaigns, but in 1929, they found one that stuck, and they've used it ever since. And that campaign phrase was, the pause that refreshes. How many times have you seen that over the years? The pause that refreshes. And I think it's the perfect phrase to describe what the Sabbath was meant to be. It was a day to rest, to be refreshed, to catch your breath. And we live in a generation that doesn't understand the whole concept of Sabbath. You know, people and nations observed the Sabbath for thousands of years. But it wasn't until we got through the Industrial Revolution that things began to change. And as we've said before, we live in this 24/7 culture. But even people who go to church, the biblical idea of the Sabbath has become strange and foreign. The Sabbath used to be the best day of the week. Now, where do you think we got the phrase TGIF? Thank God it's Friday. Because the next day was the Sabbath, was Saturday. The next day technically was the Sabbath. Now we don't even know what it is. In fact, a lot of you think that the Sabbath is an Old Testament idea that has nothing to do with us today. If you're a baby boomer, you might remember this. You remember there was a time when every store in town on Sunday was closed. You remember that? And on the books, they had what we call blue laws. Blue laws meant that if you owned a business, you could not be open on Sunday. Because then we lived in a culture that understood that men needed a day, and men and women needed a day to rest. And that concept goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. God set aside a day where Adam could just rest and catch his breath. Because even then, Adam needed a day to turn off his cell phone and to shut down his laptop and just catch his breath. And he did it to illustrate the fact that we need to stop so we can be refreshed. There's still one group of people in the world that understand this principle, and that's the Jews. Well, them and Chick-fil-A. But the Jews, there's one day in the week where you can't do a whole lot in Israel, and that's on Saturday. If you're ever in Israel on Saturday, you won't find anything to do because the whole nation shuts down. Just shuts down. The entire nation takes a breath and they enjoy the pause that refreshes. So gearing down refreshes us in our walk. Let's look at one more thing. Go back to Genesis 2 and look at something else in verse 3 again. It says, then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Now let me stop there. In some versions, it uses the word sanctified. And the word sanctified means set apart or holy. And it has to do with worship. You see, in the Old Testament, the day of rest was the Sabbath, which was the seventh day of the week. But today, of course, we observe the Sabbath principle on Sunday, which is the first day of the week. Sunday is not the Sabbath. The Sabbath is technically on Saturday. The Lord's Day is on Sunday. And this principle of the Sabbath has now been incorporated into the day we call Sunday. You see, the Sabbath existed from creation, the seventh day. There's still a day that has to be sanctified, set apart for God and God alone. And for us, that day is Sunday. Here's what I want you to see. Gearing down revives our worship. This has to do with worship. The Sabbath is about honoring God first on the very onset of the week. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but technically, Sunday is not a part of the weekend. What does weekend mean? The end of the week. When's the end of the week? Friday's the end of the week, so the weekend is Saturday. It's Saturday. The culture in which we live sees the weekend as Saturday and Sunday. But that's not the way it's supposed to be. The new week begins on Sunday. Sunday was never meant to be the end of an old week. It was meant to be the beginning of a new week. And that's why we ought to give God the first day of the week, because we ought to give God the first fruits of all our lives. We ought to give him the first dime of every dollar that we make, the first hour of every day that we wake up, the first day of every week. We need to give that to God. It's part of our worship. See, when you observe the Lord's Day and you take that as your Sabbath, what you're really doing is you're not only obeying a command of God to rest, but even more, you're letting God know that you trust him the other 6 days to take care of everything that you need. And you're acknowledging God for that. He's going to provide for you what needs to be provided for you. The Sabbath is for refreshment, and the primary way that you can be refreshed is through the worship of God. The Sabbath day in the Old Testament was never separated from corporate worship. Never. The Sabbath day in the Old Testament, from the day of Moses all through the days of the early church, never separated from corporate worship. Here's a principle I don't want you to miss. God's Sabbath is not just to be a day of rest. It is to be a day of reverence, a day of worship. Now, why do you think God wants to make sure that our day of rest is also our day of worship? Because just as you can get physically tired and run down, you can get spiritually run down. And we need a chance to recharge and refresh that spiritual part in us as well. That's why we need to go to God's house on God's day, be with God's people, study God's word, worship God's Son. We do it first, on the first day of the week. Put a scripture on the screen. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 says this: we should keep on encouraging each other to be thoughtful and to do helpful things. Verse 25 says, some people have gotten out of the habit of meeting for worship. Isn't that true? We no longer see the Sabbath day as holy. We may go one Sunday, we may skip the next. Some people have gotten out of the habit. What's a habit? Something you do over and over and over and over. But he says we must not do that. We should keep on encouraging each other, especially since you know that the day of the Lord's coming is getting closer. You see, worship, what it does is it encourages us, it supplies us with fellowship, it strengthens our faith, it soothes our feelings, it recharges our spiritual battery. And if you're really in tune with God, there's nothing you can do that is more restful than getting together with God's people, worshiping and studying God's word together. It's one of the reasons when we come in here that we really need to turn off those cell phones and anything that would distract us from focusing on God himself. So, rest is an activity, but it's an activity that has to be planned for, and then we have to pursue it. And my question to you today as we close this sermon out would be this: do you have enough courage to turn off your cell phone for 24 hours? Do you have enough courage to shut down that laptop for 24 hours? Do you have enough courage to plan a time of rest, Sabbath rest? And if you did, do you think it would make a difference in your work, in your walk, in your worship? I think it would make a tremendous difference if we just took the time to rest, to refresh ourselves, to catch our breath, to gear it down for one day of the week. As you leave this morning, they're going to be standing out there with some handout sheets. And Tim Keller is one of my favorite authors, and he wrote an article about Sabbath rest that I wanted to share with you. And it's a front and back page. It won't take you long to read it, but there are probably 5 or 6 ideas that he has on how we can practically take Sabbath rest. And the important thing to do is we can't approach it legalistically. It's not meant to be approached legalistically, because your rest is different than my rest, because we're in different places and different seasons in our lives. We're in different work schedules. We have different things going on. So my rest will look totally different than your rest. But we all need to take a time to rest. And this is just some really practical things about how to do that in your busy, busy schedule. And I know we're all busy and we're all 24/7. But we must, if we're going to balance the life God has created us to live, find time to rest. And we're going to be talking about that in the next couple of weeks. All right? Let's pray together.